The next argument that's offered works by comparing water to fire. And the way that this is presented in the video is as follows. Fire, right? We know that it burns things, right? But it's not in and of itself burned, right? Water, it wets things, but it's not in and of itself wet, okay? So again, what's happening here is there's a comparison between water and fire, maybe which are taken to be the same for other reasons. They're both elements in some of the kind of traditional, somewhat mythological tables of elements, like the ancient Greek idea of the four elements. So maybe there's an assumption that water and fire should work in the same ways in general. But one thing is noted about fire, and that's similar to water. Fire does something. It has some active property. It burns things. And likewise, water has some active property. It wets things. And on the basis of that similarity, that they both have a property like that, an ability to do something, some active property, it's claimed that if something is also true of fire, namely that it has the property, it has that as an active property, as something that it does, but it isn't itself describable as the thing that it brings about, the burning or being burned. Then likewise, water would be the same way. And this structure of argument can be represented as on the slide here. This structure is sometimes called an argument from analogy. Basically it involves two things being noted to be similar in a lot of respects, and then it's noted that one of those things has some additional feature, and since those two things are similar in so many other ways, if the first thing has this additional feature, call it feature A, then that's a reason to think that the second item has that feature as well, the fact that they're similar in so many other ways. And again, once we represent the argument in this way, it helps us to see a potential objection to the argument. In this case, we can ask why we should think that water is like fire in this additional way too. Sure, it may be like fire in a lot of ways, but does that mean it's like fire in every way? Not necessarily. We know fire and water are different in some ways also. So that's one way of putting the objection. Another way of putting the same objection or making clearer how that objection is supposed to work is to consider an example of another thing that water is like in some ways. That if it were like that thing in all ways, then we would actually want to say that water is wet. So here's an example of that. A yellow crayon, for instance. So a yellow crayon is yellow, and it also yellows the things that it rubs against. So it has the ability to yellow things. Why couldn't water be like a yellow crayon rather than like fire, for instance? And here I've just constructed an argument that has the same form as the argument that's made here by Chaz Smith, except it arrives at the opposite conclusion, simply by shifting the thing that water is compared to from fire to a yellow crayon. And so what this is supposed to show is it's not supposed to show that water, necessarily that water is or is not wet, but it's supposed to show that this argument for saying that water is not wet is not strong enough to guarantee that conclusion, because it depends on what the item is that was chosen to compare water with or to make an analogy with. In Chaz Smith's argument, that item is fire, but in this contrary argument, the item is a yellow crayon. And so it shows that the argument depends on selecting selecting something that will get the conclusion that Chaz Smith wants, but there's no reason given why that thing should be selected to analogize water with, or to be used as a model for the way that water works, rather than some other thing that could be used as a model for the way that water works.